Hi friends, my name is Eric and I'm the developer of Virtuous Heaven, which is a game about infinite dogs, radical friends, and the end of history, at least until I decide to maybe use a different tagline at some point in the future. Who knows? Things are still kind of like weirdly wobbly in a lot of things. Anyway, this is this month's development update. It's like for the month of October, but I'm doing this in early November as always. Still a tiny bit sick. I kind of got a cold last week, which is why the video is a few days late, but who cares, right? There were a lot of months where nothing was coming, so everything is good. So let's talk a little bit about what happened. A lot of good things happened, like at least in my eyes. So, like also depending on like how you look at things in general. But yeah, so my plans for last month was to redo kind of a lot of the existing enemies in the games, or like more or less to what I ended up doing was like kind of pruning a lot of like the existing enemies and unifying them in a lot of ways and making them all easier to maintain and modify, and also to change the character like parts of the characters like special ability and upgrade system. And what did I do? Well, I did these things, and I also started some like minor thematic and narrative work, which is still ongoing and will probably be a thing that's going to roll around and basically happen at least throughout this month and maybe next month as well. Though I will kind of have to make some decisions like throughout this month to at least nail down some things that I want to do and want to say, and like be very specific about. But yeah, that's something that also happened. And like most of the thematic and narrative work, weirdly enough, came from me sitting down and thinking about, okay, let's just assume I'll try to pitch Virtuous Heaven to a publisher, just in parts for the fun of it and for the practice, and also on the off chance that maybe someone wants to sign me. What kind of work would I have to do for that? What stuff do I need to be certain of? Like, how would I have to structure this? And like a lot of this like thematic work kind of like flowed out from this part, because if you want to pitch a game to a publisher, you kind of have to have a good idea of like what it's going to be about and how it's going to be structured. And in that sense, it really helped me. Or at least I think it really helped me. This is all stuff that we'll see the hopefully positive outcomes of in the next few months. But like the main work was redoing the enemies and changing the parts of like the upgrade system and like the special ability system to make it more streamlined, to bring it more in line with other parts of the systems that I want to keep, and to make it like kind of like prune down on all the things that you may have to collect while exploring in the game and all these kinds of things, all in the effort of making like reducing the bloat that is in everything in this, like what I've done so far. So to talk a little bit about like what that special ability stuff actually means, is that I kind of like, if you played the demo like months ago, you may have noticed that your way of healing was you have like had these water bottles that you had to drink, and those healed you for a certain amount of time, like a certain amount, and the amount of like healing you get and the amount of bottles you get like were like tied to like your overall health upgrades and all that kind of stuff. I got rid of that part again because I kind of want to prune away parts of like the overall upgrade system, again, to reduce like the game's like general bloat that was there, and like to make things a bit more easier for me to maintain and make the map that I'm going to have to like build this month a bit easier to build. So instead of like having this like you drink water to heal yourself system, it's kind of like, and this is so funny because it started out like that and now I'm kind of back to that. And in a weird way, it's kind of like similar to the way healing works in Hollow Knight, and also how the special attacks work in Hollow Knight, but not the same. And I didn't set out to do this, but maybe this is a moment where I realized, oh, this is why they did that. But anyway, so instead of like this water bottle system, you now have a resource, and that's something that was already in the demo, where when you attacked enemies, you basically build up a combo meter that you could then back then use to perform certain special attacks or like enhance your movement attacks and these things. I basically removed the timed element from that thing. Previously, that combo ran out after a certain amount of time has passed when you didn't attack anything. And I also made it so that you gain this resource when you get hurt. And basically kind of like and use this resource that you gain this way both as a way to heal yourself, which requires you to stand still for a certain amount of time while your character powers themselves up to, convert this resource in a way, and also to use that still as a resource to launch ranged attacks. You can still also like do the whole, at least for now, do a much more powerful movement attack with that. But what's new now, and you can kind of see in this GIF down there, that you can also launch a ranged attack where the projectile that you're launching, the kind of projectile, is determined by the convictions you have equipped. And if you go way back and whatever, convictions are things that are tied to the people that are imprisoned in the game and that you free from prison, and that kind of are like a combination of them lending you their basically their trust and their belief in your ability to basically destroy whatever it is that exists there and that you have to destroy. And the convictions are like something that give you like different effects depending on like who's you have equipped, and there's like a lot of part there. And again, there's like, I did not sit down and say, okay, let's make Hollow Knight, but make it a bit weird and with Game Boy graphics. But the convictions, like the most similar comparison would be the charm system in Hollow Knight to a degree, but not exactly, because there's an additional layer to that, all of that. But anyway, I had that part, and I wanted to tie the special attack or the projectile that you send out with this kind of resource that you acquire also to the convictions that you have equipped, in that the sequence in which you have these like specific convictions equipped change the characteristics of the projectile that you generate. And that's something that I've been trying to put into a game since 2016, I think. And now I finally found a way where I feel kind of happy with it. What you see down there in the GIF is like one of these kinds of projectiles. It's actually a very useless projectile. It's the most useless projectile of them all, because in most situations it's not going to do much. But if you can manage to find a good combination where it's like actually kind of like existing for longer than a second, and you can basically, it generates this projectile that circles around you. And the longer you can manage to keep it alive, the bigger it gets and the more damage it will deal once it hits an enemy. Neither the size of the projectile nor the damage that it will deal is going to be capped. So there is a potential for like a thing that just fills out the entire screen. The hitbox does not get bigger, so even though you have a gigantic projectile, it's still a very tiny spot that has to collide with the enemy. And it's kind of like, it's a kind of a bad example to show you because it's the most useless, but it's also the thing that kind of illustrates the idea behind it. It's something where like the upgrades you have equipped not only give you like special abilities, not only define a different special attack that you use when you use your power-up state, it also now creates like different projectiles with different characteristics when you use your regular ranged attack that you have now. And there are like different combinations that can happen, like depending on like where in each slot something is equipped. There are like 3 factors that determine it. There's like something where you can send out 2 projectiles that have different characteristics, or like if you have like basically the same like two that kind of determine the same type of projectile, it generates one that is just larger and more impactful and all that kind of stuff. It's still like in terms of like how it looks, not quite where I want it to be, but the basic structure is there and it works, and that's the first part. That's kind of cool. The other parts have to follow suit though, because right now it doesn't feel cool to use, and it needs to feel cool to use, or otherwise people just won't use it. And that would be kind of a shame. And what this also introduces is kind of like, again, a trade-off between, okay, how do I like equip my convictions? What do I want in terms of like passive abilities? What do I want in terms of like active abilities when I power up? What do I want in terms of like projectile that I'm using and all these kinds of things? And suddenly there's like a fairly, like if you want to engage with it, a fairly deep layered thing that you can do here. And I find this, again, it's kind of like something that I just like in terms of like existing complexity that you could play around with, I find interesting. There isn't quite a lot in the game that warrants you to completely engage with that kind of a complexity, but to a degree I don't mind that, because I always feel like it's much more about, and that's like a general thing with me with all of these things, is like I want there to be options for players to use. I do not completely want to force players to play and engage with these systems in a specific way, which again I kind of failed to do in the demo. We'll have to see how these next attempts go, but that's like something that's a bit more on my mind, or like something I want to try to do. So that's the one thing that I did. This took like the first half of the month roughly. The second half of the month was like doing new enemies, which again, the fun thing is most of the enemies look the same and kind of behave the same as like they did before, but the way they behave is much more unified. And that was like a huge problem with the project in general, because it started out in 2017, in late 2017, and went through several iterations of starting to work on, stopping to work on it, several months or up to a year of like not touching it at all, and then coming back to it, starting again on it, and so on and so on. And each time I learned new things, had new ideas, so there's like a gigantic pile of like enemies in there, or were in there, with like each having like different types of like how they moved in a level, how they reacted to the player, how they did their attacks, how they timed them, and all that kind of stuff. And and that was really hard to maintain and really hard to fix bugs with, and like kind of like it was very hard for me to be sure that they worked like universally in all situations. And it also made it very hard for me to like add new things to like how enemies behave in general, because like for example, it was impossible for me prior to the step that I just did to make enemies that the players could send flying, or like basically to in general say, okay, the attacks the players do can send them flying, can send them to a different part in the map, and then guarantee that the enemy would behave in the same way as they did in their original position. That was not possible, because a lot, especially of the ground-bound enemies, were very, very rigidly, like had very rigidly defined ways that made sure that they didn't walk off platforms and did other weird things. That's all fixed. It's now theoretically possible to basically teleport one enemy from one spot to a different spot, and it would behave in exactly the same way. Because again, I made sure that the thing actually does that. And the way in which I did this, I defined a handful of archetypes for enemies, like one enemy that is most basically say, okay, this is a type of enemy that freely moves around the player. Then there's an enemy that walks around on a platform. then there's a type of enemy that mostly moves via jumping towards the player, or like doing something that involves them getting airborne to some degree. And then there are enemies that just don't move at all and just attack. And I created these 4 archetypes, and then basically derived all of the enemies that I decided to keep using for this next attempt at finishing this game. Derive these from like these specific archetypes. And what I noticed a lot of things while I did this conversion process, in that I now had very specific, like, it made things much more easier for me to maintain. For example, like I already mentioned, like, okay, it's now much more easier for me to fix problems, because when I see that an enemy behaves strangely in a specific way, for one, I know every type of enemy that shares the same archetype will most likely behave in the same way, and I also know where exactly this problem should be located, because all of these share the same basic type of code among them. Then then it's much more easier for me to come up with new enemy types, or like new types of attacks, because I now know exactly how much work I need to put in to make a new enemy, how many different sets of animations and sprites I would need, and also how to properly, within this archetype system, differentiate them from one another. So for example, if I have like this enemy archetype that moves towards the player via jumping and then doing something, either at the, like, when they're jumping, or like while they're jumping, or after they jumped in some way, I now know, okay, now I can make something that attacks before they jump. And then I can make something that attacks while they're jumping. Then I can make something that attacks after they jumped. I can also make something that attacks after a certain amount of jumps. I can also then further create variation by making different types of attacks. Some might just attack with a ranged attack. Some might drop down on the player or move towards the player in some kind of like dive bombing motion or whatever. So there's like a much broader degree, or it's much more easier for me to understand, okay, I have this basic pattern of things, and now I can think of ways on how to create variation within that pattern, but the basic pattern will always stay the same. And that's just from a create variation standpoint is much more easier to do and much more easier to maintain. Overall, I still think it should lead to things that are not completely predictable, because there are like other things that you can vary. You can vary the animation timing, how long it takes an enemy to attack, how quickly they react towards the player, when they are reacting towards the player, their like radius of like where they detect the player, and all these kinds of things. So there's like still a lot of stuff where you can further differentiate different unit types from one another. So that's kind of a cool thing. And overall, again, and to the like at the end, it's easier to plan for me when I know, okay, a jumper enemy, for example, requires me to have like 3 different types of animations. Like it needs one animation for like their stationary state or like their idle state. Then I need an animation for like when they're jumping. Then I need an animation when they're attacking. And it needs like that amount of frames in general, like at least 3 frames or whatever. That's much easier for me to then plan ahead and understand, okay, this will probably take me that long to do. And then and again, because it's all a very much shared like code base, it's fairly easy to convert then this set of animations into a working enemy. I realized that while I was converting these enemies, like converting an enemy from like their old state into this new archetype took me about an hour maybe, like give or take. Whereas previously when I sat down and basically coded most of these enemies separately from scratch, it usually took me much longer. And then there was always the thing of like them not exactly like maybe working in the way I wanted them to work and whatever. And now, since I know what kind of limitations these archetypes overall have, I can kind of like, it's much more easier for me to project and to plan with these things. And again, that should making this game much easier in the future. And it's something I'm wondering why I didn't do that in the first place and all these kinds of things, because it's a bit unfortunate. But that's again also like the function of me, like in previous attempts with this game, or like in general, like always kind of feeling rushed and feeling like I have to make this game, I have to get it done, and like and then deciding to never spend a month or half a month to just set up the system and then work out from the system. So I'm glad that I did this preparatory work, because again, it will make things in the future much more much easier to do. And I also plan, like when I get around to like working on boss fights for this game, to do something similar for the boss fights, where I have basically an archetypical boss fights with a specific set of states and like different types of attacks, and then just create variation within the system for each boss fight. So again, that I can create more things quicker, in a very predictable way, because that's right now the thing that I have to like, that's like in terms of like finding ways to fill this game with things is probably the most pressing thing to figure out and to understand. And it again, and that overall should make creating more variety easier. And that's the idea, and I'll I hope it works, but I'm fairly optimistic that it does. And again, should I run into something where I realize, oh, this type of enemy just doesn't work in that way, I know where to fix them, and I know how basically to adjust them for everything else, and that's a good thing. What I also did, and this is like what you can see in the GIF a little bit, is I started to work on making the enemies more kinetic, like in the sense that they physically get moved by the player's attacks. Right now it's only after you've destroyed them, where you can kind of like punch them around and send them flying and send them into a wall, and when they hit a wall they explode. And there's a nice mechanic behind it where you get more of your power points if you can keep like an exploding enemy on screen for longer. If you keep punching it kind of like and then destroy it, you get more points out of it as opposed to like if you just let it explode on its own. And I got this idea, and this is like the other part, and this also kind of like made me think about I should really update the sound effects in this game. I played Kirby and the Amazing Mirror a little bit, and I realized, wow, the fighter ability in these Kirby games feels a lot like what you do in Virtuous Heaven. And maybe like one of the reasons for it is because like the fighter ability in Kirby games is like one of my favorite abilities, even though it's not very useful in a lot of ways. It's kind of like clumsy to use a lot of times. But especially in Kirby and the Amazing Mirror, it has like a lot of very cool sound effects, and you can do a cool uppercut and send enemies flying and then they explode and all these kind of things. And I kind of want to push the way like the game feels and how your attacks interact with enemies and all that kind of stuff. Kind of want to push that more towards this, because I realized a little bit that the way I built the whole game feel portion of Virtuous Heaven, I mean, it's largely lifted from my other action games, which were all projectile based, where you shoot an enemy and then it explodes. However, shooting an enemy and letting them explode is a bit different when you like physically move into them, because there's like move into them with speed, or like use like a very impactful physical attack on them. And it's kind of like the way enemies behave when they get hit by by a punch should be different as when they get hit by a projectile. You could make an argument projectile is also like a physical force, and yes, to a degree, sure, and all that kind of stuff, but like it doesn't feel, it's not that disconnected. And I think that was like also like one thing maybe that was always kind of like in the background bugging me about like how the game played, but I couldn't really articulate. But we'll have to see. I'm going to be very careful with the making them react to your punches a bit more, because not that the enemies now will completely break, but I do not want to push it too much into like a character action game thing where it's like all about physically letting launching enemies in the air and then doing air combos with them and all that kind of stuff. But I want to add like some elements of it, and I want everything to feel a bit more impactful and more like kinetic and physical in general. And again, we'll have to see how that part goes, and I have some ideas about it, how I want to go about that. And also like this whole part kind of like depends on like how much HP do enemies have, like how long are you going to engage with them in any way, because like for example right now most enemies have a fairly low amount of HP, so they explode very quickly. So if they only are kind of like physics objects to a degree, once they explode it's kind of okay if they are not that before, and so on and so on. But it's something I'll keep working on over time. But like I'm glad that at least now the things are in place that would let me do that, because prior to that it was impossible. So that's kind of cool. So yeah, that's that part. Let's talk more about this month. It's kind of like fairly basic, which is the plan is to conceptualize and build a rough version of the entire map for the game. I wanted to start with that last week. I did a tiny bit of research in how to like maybe do a more structured approach to that. But that was that because again I got sick, and then I decided, well, it might just be a good idea to just lay on my couch for a few days. But that's kind of like the plan for the rest of the week, to start with like conceptualizing how I want to do that, and then also like kind of like creating the technical basis for it, like how do I have to set up the room, what kind of like requirements do I have, what's a good size for the map, and all that kind of stuff. I want to do that, and basically towards the end of the month have kind of have the entire, or like most of the map for the entire game done, minus most of the graphical assets and boss fights and story elements. But basically want to have something kind of like a block out of everything where I can run through things, test different progression types, test different other things, get a better understanding of like what this needs, like how dense everything is, or like, and all that kind of stuff, and basically have that in place, and then we'll see how December comes. Right now the idea for December is then to sit down and do this kind of like conceptualizing and like rough building for boss fights, and during all that time keep working on the thematic outlining and like giving the game a better and a stricter narrative structure, thinking more about like character motivations and like state of the world at the beginning, what the proposed end state of the world is, and all that kind of stuff. That is a bit more, at least for me personally, I don't know how much will end up in the game. For me, like much more like precise than what I had before, which was like a vague collection of ideas and moments. And I kind of want to be a bit more precise there. Again, I started working on that. There's still a lot that I need to figure out and like want to figure out. And also have to keep in mind with that part is how much extra work this might be, and like how I want to do that, how I want to communicate these things, all that kind of stuff. But that's kind of like stuff that's going to go and happen on the side. Same with preparing something that I can pitch to publishers relating to that game, to this game. which like I think I said it a few times already. I do not expect much in terms of like results, but this is like for me mostly to get used to this kind of approach, get used to this kind of like thinking about games in terms of like it being a product that you sell. Because again, if you want to earn money with this, you kind of have to approach it like that, even though like parts of it are awful, but you know, some things you just have to do then in the end, because everything is kind of flawed and awful. Yeah, so that's what's planned. I'm really glad how like the last month went. It wasn't a guarantee that things worked out in the way that they did, because I had no idea if like the the plan I had in place, the schedule that I had in place and made for myself would work in the way I hoped it would work. And with some minor problems, it mostly worked really well. And I'm really glad that I made these adjustments that I did to it, and that I decided to take the time with this game to take stock of what I have, what I want it to be, and just to do the work to make sure that both of these elements are kind of more aligned than they were before. To spend some time to just get rid of a lot of like technical like trash that just amassed over the years, over half of a decade that like this project exists in some form or another. So and obviously there's a lot of stuff that isn't really needed anymore. And why should I keep it around at this point when I kind of want to push this now from a weird tech demo thing I made for myself and I had no idea what I wanted it to be for, towards something that is like an actual game with all the things that you do in a game in a way. So I'll keep you all posted on that. And if you want to know more, well, if you still have a Twitter account, I guess you can follow @Mokograd on Twitter. I barely post on there like ever, but it exists. You can follow there if there are like major announcements. Usually there's something there. If I not forget to post there. If you have an account on co-host, you can also follow @Mokograd on co-host. Again, if there are like major things I post there, I also like occasionally use it for jokes on myself, like in weird ways. The best part of like maintaining two social media accounts, honestly, is that you can get into like pretended fights with yourself. That's what I occasionally use my co-host account, both of my co-host accounts for. You can also subscribe to my email newsletter, which is at tinyletter.com/Mokograd. I recently learned that MailChimp, which is the company that also maintains TinyLetter, apparently is going to do like some weird large data-based like language model shit with their email, like with the email newsletters that they have, and the accounts that are on there. So like I should probably move it somewhere else, but also I'm very because the reason why I mentioned this is because last month I finally sent out a newsletter, and I have another one planned that I'm going to send out next weekend. So there's actually stuff happening now that the company decided to be awful. So who knows? Right now, I'll still just keep it there, because if a large language model decides to train itself on my wonky English and my weird political views, then go ahead, because it's not going to be very helpful. So, but in general, like I should probably move it, but also, that's more work, and I just started, so I'll probably just keep it there for a while, and then I figure something out. But again, I just started. The newsletter is mostly going to be like a review of the month, and then me talking a little bit about like things that I watched or read, or like other things that I found interesting, and sharing them, and then maybe like talking a little bit about like things that went in my head during that time. And like, random thoughts about things, and how the world operates and all that kind of jazz. But yeah, you can subscribe to that on that address that's listed there. And obviously, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can subscribe to this channel. YouTube is also awful, but that's a different thing. But you can do that. If you have a Steam account, Wishlist Witcher 7 on Steam. The game is actually being worked on again. Hooray! And yeah, it'll be cool. I hope. Please wishlist it, and also follow like the game on Steam. I think that's also a cool thing, because you then get like better information on like what's being posted about it, like on Steam itself. You can also follow the Mokograd developer page. That's also something you can do on Steam. I never really engaged with that part, but it exists. So do these things if like my games interest you. And also please buy them. I have two that are out on Steam, and they're kind of cool. But anyway, hope you have a nice month. See you around next month. And yeah, bye.